A few months ago, Hannah, my partner, and I went to dinner at a new restaurant on the opening weekend. And there was a sign at the entrance that greeted us saying, "Soft opening, please be patient with our staff as they get oriented." Our waiter came, she asked us for our drink orders, and Hannah ordered this drink called a hop water, H-O-P, hop water, which is like a fizzy, non-alcoholic drink. I ordered my drink, and then a few minutes later, the waiter brought to the table some glasses, and Hannah's was this clear liquid that was almost boiling with steam pouring out over the edges. And he walked away, and we were staring at each other in confusion, and then I said to her, "I think that he thought you ordered hot water." And lo and behold, she tasted it, and it was full of really hot water. Our waiter had misunderstood the instructions. He had misheard the order that was given. In our passage today, Jesus' disciples, James and John, also misunderstand their instructions. They fail to comprehend the mission that Jesus has given them. Jesus and his disciples were Jews living under the occupation of a foreign government, the Roman Empire. So the disciples grew up in a Jewish culture where at least some of their peers and mentors held this belief that God was going to help the Jewish people overthrow the Romans by force. And so when James and John come ask Jesus for a favor, they project onto him their assumptions about this political takeover that they believe is on the horizon. They ask Jesus, "Let us sit at your left and your right hand when this happens." This was standard political language at that time. They're imagining that Jesus has come to lead a military revolution, and they ask that once God has helped them overcome the Romans through a violent rebellion, whether they could be Jesus' second in command when he becomes king. Jesus is quick to correct the disciples. He explains that he is not like the political rulers of the day who seek to, quote, rule as tyrants over the people. In other words, the disciples thought that Jesus would energize their nationalistic movement so that they could impose their political will upon their enemies. But Jesus clarifies that his movement is diametrically opposed to ruling by force. In reading Mark 10 to prepare for this sermon, its connection to this historical moment was obvious to me. It was obvious because in the same way that James and John misunderstood their assignment from Jesus, there's a large group of Christians right now in America who are misunderstanding the assignment that Jesus has given us. The umbrella term we can use to describe a large group of Christians who are misunderstanding Jesus' mission is called Christian nationalism. Over the last year, the nonpartisan research group PRRI, the Public Religion Research Institute, surveyed 22,000 Americans about their perspectives on the relationship between politics and religion. This group's primary aim was to understand how and where Christian nationalist beliefs were popping up in America. PRRI identified 5 core beliefs that characterize a Christian nationalist worldview, and here they are. The U.S. government should declare America a Christian nation. U.S. laws should be based on Christian values. If the U.S. moves away from its Christian foundations, we will not have a country anymore. Being Christian is an important part of being truly American. And 5th, God has called Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of American society. So Christian nationalism is a political belief system. It's not a religious tradition. It uses a framework that merges American nationalism with Christian identity and says these have to be one thing. Equally important to Christian nationalism is the belief that to be a true Christian, you must affirm and promote a particular political agenda. It's very, very important to understand that when I'm talking about Christian nationalism, I'm not condemning or endorsing any particular political party, candidate, or movement. Nor am I making generalizing statements about Christian denominations. The PRRI survey did find that the rate of Christian nationalist beliefs were more prevalent in certain groups. For example, 66% of white evangelicals displayed Christian nationalist characteristics, compared to about 33% of white mainline Protestants. But that shows that no blanket statement can be made, right? We can't just simplify this into black and white groups. There are Christian nationalist beliefs operative in respondents who are Republican, who are Democrat, who are independent, who are Catholic, who are Protestant, who are evangelical. Our goal here is not to overgeneralize, but to understand the danger of Christian nationalism wherever it's showing up, and to interrogate in ourselves whether these beliefs are there. And it shows up at a significant rate in America. Among Americans who attend a religious service weekly, 52% fall into this category of endorsing these 5 points. So more than half the people worshiping in religious communities at this moment, this morning, believe that God calls Christians to exercise dominion over all areas of society, right? More than half. Christian nationalism is incompatible with the gospel of Jesus Christ. So let's take a minute to unpack why I believe that's the case. What people sympathetic to Christian nationalism do is take their particular, narrow, and often exclusionary interpretations of the Bible and try to impose those restrictions upon all Americans through policy. They believe that God asks them to work through politics to force all Christians who disagree with them and all the non-Christians in this country to conform to several particular lifestyle choices. So let me give you an example. People who endorse Christian nationalism usually have a particular reading of Scripture that leads them to believe that the only valid family structure is one biological man marrying one biological woman, often with the expectation that that woman will bear children. Moreover, they often have a particular rigid set of norms for what genders someone is allowed to be, who can have sex with who, and within what marital parameters. And this can lead some endorsers of Christian nationalist perspectives to pass laws that restrict any practices that don't align with their own experiences of sexuality or gender identity or marriage. So that includes things like banning gender-affirming care for minors. It includes forbidding public school employees from having the most basic conversations about sexual orientation or gender pronouns with youth. It includes banning books from public schools that express views and experiences that don't fit into this Christian nationalist framework under the smokescreen of censoring sexually explicit content, while still allowing the Bible, which is full of sex and violence, right, to remain available in public schools. Now, I, as a Christian, could reasonably challenge the biblical interpretations that are being used to justify the policies that I just named. I could point out that there were many family structures in the Bible, none of which look like the heterosexual monogamy that we have today. I could point to the way that Jesus radically challenged the traditional family structure in the Gospels, and how the early church's relationships took many unorthodox forms. I could point to the story in the book of Acts about the Ethiopian eunuch, a sexual minority who was welcomed into the church without having to change their sexual or gender identity. But on the other hand, Christian nationalism takes its restrictive reading on family and sexuality and then seeks to impose that ethic upon all people in America, whether they agree or not, whether they're Christian or not. It's fine to have that interpretation. It's a different thing to take that biblical interpretation and try to make it public policy that everyone has to abide by. This came to a head, of course, on January 6, 2021, when a violent mob attacked the Capitol and sought to disrupt our democracy's peaceful transition of power. And throughout that mob of people carrying weapons and nooses, you could see folks praying, displaying crosses and other Christian symbols, conveying that they thought that God was with them in this quest to disrupt this political process. This tracks with this PRRI research, which found that Christian nationalists are about twice as likely as other Americans to believe that political violence is justified. And 40% of folks who hit these markers agree that, quote, because things have gotten so far off track, true American patriots may have to resort to violence to save this country. In one form, Christian nationalism is expressed by misinformed Christians, who I believe are creating harm when they impose restrictions on everyone else. But in another, more insidious form, some Christian nationalists are people who are simply hungry for power and are co-opting Jesus to justify hatred, exclusion, and violence. And I'm personally not content letting our religious symbols get manipulated to those ends. I grieve for victims of Christian nationalism. But you know what? I also grieve for people who are Christian nationalists, who think that I have to control others in order to obey God. That feels like it would be a really painful and anger-filled way to live your life, and I don't think it's what Christ created us for. So let's loop back around to our biblical text in Mark. James and John misunderstood Jesus' assignment. And in a similar way, Christian nationalism has misunderstood Jesus' assignment. So where do we go from here? I'm not saying that we can't be patriotic, right? There is absolutely a way to love America, to serve America, to be grateful for the sacrifices of soldiers who have protected America. You can do all that without believing you must force all Americans to conform to one set of behaviors, right? We can separate those two. And I'm not saying that our faith shouldn't inform our politics. Our faith is personal, but it can't be private. Our faith should absolutely inform our politics. Jesus talked about it all the time. He talked about money. He talked about property. He talked about how we treat our neighbors. That's all political conversation. The task for us is to do the hard, the complex work of translating our Christian values into the public sphere. That's complicated, right? See, whereas endorsers of Christian nationalism want to force everyone to be Christian in their particular way, I believe we as Christians should seek to engage politics so that we're inching our world towards one that coheres with Jesus' core values: love, justice, liberation. This is what Jesus means when he says, you know that among the Gentiles, those whom they recognize as rulers lord it over them, right? Impose themselves over them, but you must be servants of all. How do we translate that into our politics? For all the focus that some people have on making America a Christian nation, I find it funny that Jesus never uses the phrase Christian nation. Did you notice that? Not once in the Gospels. He almost never talks about nations, but one of the few times he does is in Matthew chapter 25. It's when he says that he's going to come back to judge the nations, and I think we have to take this seriously. In that parable, he doesn't talk about asking his followers whether they restricted abortions. He doesn't ask if they limited LGBTQ rights. He doesn't ask if they banned books. He doesn't bring any of that up. You know what he does? He says that the nation that he will recognize will be one who fed the hungry, gave drink to the thirsty, clothed the naked, comforted the sick, and visited the prisoner. If that's what we mean by a Christian nation, then I can get behind that. I can get behind the project of making America a place where all people are fed, where all people have affordable housing, where all people have affordable health care, where all prisoners are rehabilitated humanely. Instead of fighting culture wars, Christians should be fighting for an America where there are no poor people and everyone has enough. You probably know there's an election coming up. And hear me, no party, no candidate is the Christian choice, right? No one's Jesus Christ. No candidate is going to save us. But it's our responsibility, y'all, to ask, how can I vote and donate and work for movements that are closest to these core principles of Jesus? Friends, Jesus was not a Christian nationalist. He came to serve, not to be served. And as Christians, we should only give our support to movements that reflect these core values of Jesus: love, justice, liberation. Imperfect though we are, may God's Spirit guide us as we work to discern what that looks like. Amen.